Welcome back to the second morning session. And we are very happy to hear from Kamalika Chaudhuri. She is a professor at UC San Diego in CS, and most recently, actually, a research director at FAIR at Meta. And she got her PhD from Berkeley and has been at UC San Diego. And she has done that's actually true. For too long. So at FAIR most recently, she's done a lot of influential work in trustworthy machine learning, privacy, and related areas. And today she will talk about memorization in foundation models.
So thank you so much for the nice introduction. So as you saw, since I work for a tech company, it's hard for me to get the technology working, but we managed to get it working. So, okay. So what I am going to do today is I am going to talk about some recent work we've been doing on measuring memorization in various different kinds of foundation models. Okay. So this is, before I go into this, let me warn you that this isn't really theory. It's so there are no theorems that we proved in these papers, but these are so this is more about measurement, right? More about doing empirical measurement properly. And as you will see as we go along, there are some nice theoretical ideas that show up in this work, and unfortunately, I may not have the time to do it, but I'm really hoping that some of you might get interested and maybe come up with some nice problems or formalizations and solve them. And yeah, okay. So what are some of the questions that we are looking at? So one of the questions that we have been looking at is how do we empirically measure memorization in various different kinds of foundation models, okay? And the answer to this question, so this is not a, by the way, this is not a new question, right? In the field of privacy, for example, people have been very interested in understanding memorization for a pretty long time, and they have been looking at it from the perspective of, from the perspective of classifiers, right? Like people were trying to reason about this, people were trying to prove theorems about this, also do some empirical measurement of memorization for quite a long time, but a lot of the stuff had been kind of restricted to classifiers. But over the last few years, as we have seen, we have kind of moved a fair bit, right? We have gone from classifiers to representation learning, and this was around let's just say 2018 to 2021. That was kind of a big thing. Still we are doing some of this. Then came the LLMs, and then and then in I don't know how much of this is true, but 2025 is supposed to be the year of the AI agent, right? So we are kind of moving forward, and what we are trying to do over here is to figure out how to do this for these, empirically measure privacy or memorization for these kinds of increasingly complex foundation models. And what we find is that you can do somewhat different, you need somewhat different notions, even though maybe there are some underlying principled notions over here, but you need somewhat different notions and somewhat different measurements for different kinds of models, right? And in today's talk, what I'm going to do is tell you about some recent work we've been doing in the space of both representation learning and then large language models, okay? So what do I mean by representation learning? So this is kind of, kind of a cartoonist, like one slide cartoonist version of representation learning, right? So what happens is you take a whole bunch of, this is usually this is the thing in computer vision. You take a whole bunch of images, right? And then, you kind of train the model on these images, and the model takes in an image, and in the end, it will give you a vector of numbers. And the magic here that will happen is that these vectors will be clustered semantically, in the sense that, you know, if you had two images of airplanes, they will be closer together than, let's say, an airplane and a tiger, right? Or, you know, here, for example, airplanes are closer together, they're close to birds, which are close to swans, and which are close to otters, right? And the interesting thing to kind of keep in mind in representation learning is that all of this kind of happens in an unsupervised manner. So you do not feed these labels, you don't tell the model what is in the image. So when you are training the model, you just give them the images, and then you know, and then what comes out are these vectors, and then these vectors are automatically semantically clustered, right? So that's that's what is done. And the question is, how do we measure memorization in these kinds of representation learning models? Okay, so what was some prior work? So some prior work before we started, people had looked at measuring memorization in classification, and there were, generally speaking, there were two kinds of things that people were doing, right? So one was something called attribute inference, and here the idea was the following. If, let's just say, you know, you're trying to classify X, right? You're trying to get Y given X. If you're given some features of X and let's just say a model which has, you know, X as its training data, can you predict the rest? Right? Or can you predict a label? Sorry, not can you predict the label Y, but can you, given some features of X, can you predict the rest, right? And the idea was that, you know, the rest of the features might be fairly sensitive features, right? So that was attribute inference. The other thing that people had looked at was something called membership inference. And here the idea was that you had some model, maybe you had some auxiliary data, and given a data point X, Y, what you want to do is figure out if this is in the training data of your model. And again, this could be an issue because, you know, if you could do this, because the training data might be confidential. Also, if you could do this for like partial completions and maybe there were some features that were sensitive, you may be able to violate privacy. So these were some of the motivations behind why people were doing things like this, right? So this was kind of one line of work, and you know, obviously I'm leaving out a lot of things in between, so this is kind of two broad clusters, if you will. And in the generative model space, especially for image generative models, what people had looked at was text to image generation, right? And in fact, there was a paper by Carlin et al. On training data extraction, and this is, you know, kind of the example of the sort of things they did. So in the training set had, you know, a picture of this lady, Anne Graham Lotz, and you know, she's probably famous in computer science now, but she's a preacher in, I think she's a preacher in Atlanta. And if you gave the prompt Anne Graham Lotz, and exactly the same picture that was in the training data comes out, right? So, so that was kind of memorization. So that was, that's kind of, you know, what they did, okay? However, doing this in representation learning is a little bit harder. So why is this harder? First of all, there are no decoders, unlike generative models, right? In a representation learning model, you are feeding the image and you're getting this vector, right? It's not like you're getting the image back. So there's like, you know, the other, you know, the process goes one way, right? So that's, so that makes it a little bit harder to do the measurement properly. The second thing is we, you know, and this is always true for the computer vision space, is we need to quantify inexact memorizations, right? So it's not like you will get verbatim the same image back, you will get something similar, or you will be able to predict some feature of the image and so on, okay? So that's the second. And then the third thing is the data. So, which is, so if you look at the data that is used to train these representation learning models, so, you know, I will mostly be talking about, you know, image representation learning models, which are trained on, which are still trained on basically ImageNet or enhanced versions of ImageNet, because the data is actually good and clean. And so, for our experiments, the models are all trained on ImageNet, and so this is the kind of data that you have, right? So, so you have like limited auxiliary information in the sense that, you don't have any prompts and things like that. So you have to kind of figure out what's going on with the data over here, okay? Okay, so how do we measure memorization in this setting? And kind of the key idea behind our paper is to predict the foreground label of an image. So as you saw, we are talking about images like ImageNet, where there is a foreground and a background. In more complex image data sets, that's not the case, but anyway, that's a different matter. But there is a foreground and a background, and what we want to do is we want to predict the foreground label from the image background. So notice that this goes the other way around. We are hoping to predict foreground from the background, okay? So just to give you an example of this, so suppose this is our background. What do you think is in the foreground? Okay, so you may have seen some pictures from our paper, but as it happens, in this case, it is indeed a black swan. But I mean, there are other possibilities are also, the other things are also possible. There could be a boat, there could be, a crane, there could be a flamingo, and so on and so forth, right? And so the idea for us is that if our model is able to do this task, right, we give it a patch of water, and it's suddenly able to tell us that there's a black swan, then, so we are kind of, then something is off, and we are kind of hoping to capture this, okay? But let me ask you, is this enough? Is this memorization? So it turns out that that is not necessarily true, because the other possibility that could happen with this, here is your data set might be really messed up. And remember I kept talking about what is in the data, so this is kind of where things come in. What could have happened is, it's not really true, but it's possible that maybe you trained your model on a data set which only has black swans next to the water, right? So ImageNet, maybe it only has black swans next to the water, and then if you give it the background, the foreground obviously comes up, and this is something called data set level correlation. So what we need to do when we measure memorization is we need to separate memorization from this kind of data set level correlation, okay? So how do we do this? So the first solution we looked at was by using a similar second model, okay? So what do we do over here? So we take our training data, we divide into data set A and data set B, we train model A on data A, model B on data B, and then we can kind of do the same procedure. So if you look at, for example, if this image was in the model A's training set, but not in model B's, then we could feed this background to both models, right? So you feed it to model A, you take this, you get the representation A, based on this representation A, you can maybe make some prediction, and similarly for model B, and if A is able to predict this correctly, right, if A is able to say black swan and B is not able to say black swan, which it shouldn't, because it hasn't seen this particular image, even though it has seen images of other water patches, then what you're getting is what we call deja vu memorization, okay? How do we do this prediction? So as it turns out, so we had gotten up to the representation, now we have to get from the representation to the label. And the way we do this is actually, a simple algorithm, basically just k nearest neighbor on the holdout data. So our data set is in fact data set A and data set B, and then an extra holdout data. So and then we do our prediction by looking at k nearest neighbor on this holdout data. Okay, so now the question is, do representation learning models show this kind of deja vu memorization? So let me show you an example. So this is an example, and in fact, this is an example where it does show deja vu memorization. So if you build a representation learning model and you get the representation A, these are its nearest neighbors, right? Its nearest neighbors. So you take that patch of water, and this image was in the training set, you take this patch of water, and then you get the representation out of the model, and then you look at its k nearest neighbor on a completely separate holdout set. The nearest neighbors are all pictures of black swans, right? So your prediction would be black swan. But if you took a different model which didn't have this image in the training set, then you would get, in one case you see a crane, in one case you see a flamingo, the other case I think is an otter, and so on. Right? So here, so this is a case where you do see memorization. I also want to show you one interesting case of data set level correlation. So data set level correlation also happens quite a bit. And so, I just found this out after I started working on this paper, but it turns out the yellow garden spider has a very typical spider web, right? If you see the spring-like thing, that is a very typical spider web made by the yellow garden spider. And so if you give that as the background, you always get yellow garden spider, no matter what model you give it to. Right? So this is an example of, data distribution encoding these correlations, right? And this correlation is getting encoded into the model. So we do need to be careful. Okay. Okay. Now, how do we do this actual measurement? So we look at something called the deja vu score, which is, so here P is the confidence. So you have, if you're doing 5 nearest neighbors, you'll have some confidence. So basically accuracy of the model A minus the accuracy of the model B for greater than equal to P% confident prediction. So if you just take any prediction and, the model is, and then nearest neighbors are all over the place, then what happens is, the results are kind of random. So this is just to make sure to reduce the variance. And what we do see is that there is a gap, right? So here, here if you look at, for example, what I'm showing is that the red curve is the, VICREG, which is a particular representation learning model. And then here the dashed red line is the reference model. And you can see that there is this label inference accuracy, right? There is a big gap. Because the reference model isn't trained with this data point. So, so there is a bit of a gap, okay? And the other interesting thing is that you can kind of do the same procedure with supervised learning, right? You can try to do the same thing with classification. And there the gap is much smaller. Okay. Okay, so now, there are, we have more results which shows that, this kind of deja vu memorization happens quite a bit. Here what we are doing is we are still looking at VICREG. We are training the model for a certain number of epochs. Linear probe gap is, think about that as a generalization gap for representation learning. So the generalization gap goes down, which means the model generalizes better, but deja vu memorization kind of goes up. Okay. On the other side, sorry, I get left and right confused. On the right side, you see also what happens when you increase the training data set, right? So we are increasing the training data set from 100K to 500K, and you can see the generalization gap goes down, but the deja vu score stays more or less the same in this case. So somehow this, we are measuring something a little bit different from generalization over here. Okay. We also looked at a whole bunch of different kinds of models. This gets better. Somehow it's better in the newer vision transformer models. It was worse in the older ResNet models. If you increase the number of parameters in the model, it somehow gets better. Yeah. Up to a certain point, it gets better. So that's so those are some of the things, patterns that we see. Okay, so this was all very good. We could actually do the measurement, but the real problem over here is, if you're trying to do this, and let's say somebody has trained their model, and now they're interested in, how much does it memorize, and what could be my privacy risk, or something like that. The problem is that they're not going to train a second model for that, right? Anyways, the really big models now cost millions of dollars to train. So, imagine getting 2 similar models trained on this joint data. Data is also expensive. So, so that is a bit of a challenge, right? So how do we get a second similar model? And what we decided to do as a result of that is we did a second round of approximations where instead of training the second model, we tried to approximate the output of the second model with another proxy. Okay? So, and ideally, as you can imagine, ideally this would be a proxy that doesn't memorize as much, so like a simpler proxy. Okay? So, we looked at two kinds of proxies. So, one was a naive-Bayes classifier. So, here what we did was, you have this background patch, right? What you do is you annotate it. So there is something called segment anything, which will segment and then annotate objects in your image. So we kind of pushed it through segment anything, and we can get these annotations. So for example, here you would get water, ripple, light, things like this. And then we would fit a naive-Bayes classifier, which doesn't look at the image, only uses the annotation to predict the label. Okay, so and the label here could here it's swan, but I mean it could be swan flamingo. But the issue here is that this object is not in the image, right? So the swan is not in the image. So you're trying to predict what is in the foreground based on the background. Okay. However, notice that if your data had data set level correlations, if all patches of water were next to swan in ImageNet, then it would show up here. Right, so it will capture the data set level correlations. Okay. Okay. Then the second proxy that we look at is a ResNet classifier. So if you remember a couple of slides ago, I was showing you that classifiers have much lower deja vu memorization, right? And so here we are hoping to exploit that to train, so we trained a ResNet classifier based on these background patches and to predict the label. So if you remember, this is a little bit different because in representation learning, you never get to see the actual labels, right? In representation learning, you just look at the unlabeled images, and which is why we have to do a round of k-nearest neighbor to get the prediction. So there you don't actually see the labels. Here you directly train it with the labels with standard supervised learning, okay? And again, this will give you the data set level correlations. See that the patch of water doesn't have the object, but you will still get the data set level correlation because if such a correlation was there, it would show up. Okay. Okay. So basically, then this is the difference between a two model versus one model test. In the two models, so you have your SSL A. This is an image which was in the training set. In the two model set, you would have extra data to build something else. Whereas in the one model test, you will use these proxy models instead of the second model, right? So this either the ResNet classifier or this object annotator get the object annotations and then run it through naive-Bayes. Okay. So how much do these? So basically, what you're getting is labels that are indicative of data set level correlation. How much do these correlated labels agree? It turns out not a whole lot, but that is to be expected because if you think about it, you are really trying to do a task which is not causally possible, right? Like if you have a background, you don't necessarily know what's in the foreground. You can have a few guesses, but you shouldn't be too accurate in predicting, right? If you are too accurate in predicting what is in the foreground, maybe your data set is not very diverse, right? So, so that's, so this is to be expected because it's a hard prediction task. You shouldn't be able to predict this. Anyway, but then, so not a lot. But then the more interesting thing over here is how much do these, how do the 2 and 1 model tests compare? Okay, and here what we did was, so the red bar is the 2 model test, so the aggregate memorization measured by the 2 model test, and the red bars are the 2 model test, and these colors are different versions of the 1 model test. So the blue is the classifier that I talked about, and then these other colors like green, gray, and yellow are 3 versions of naive-Bayes classification. And what you see over there is these are, they track more or less, they are more or less the same, they more or less track. And then these 3, Vic, Craig, Barlow twins, and Dino, these are 3 representation learning models, okay? Okay. The next question is, how much do the, kind of open source models, so, let's say somebody has trained a model and released it into the wild. Now for the first time we can actually measure memorization in them, right? Before we couldn't do it because we needed a second model. Now we can actually do it because, we can just pull the model and do it. And here, again what we see is, so there's no second model, but we see that these results are a little bit different, but they're within, I would say, 5 to 7 points of each other. Some are overestimating, maybe some are overestimating, some are underestimating, but they're all within 5 to 7 points of each other. There's a couple of interesting things to observe over here. So first of all, the memorization is actually less than the models which were trained on less data, right? So these are kind of the models whose architectures are set to the right parameters, architecture, hyperparameter, everything has been set in the right setting. And they memorize less than the models which had trained on less data, okay, when we did the two model test. So that is one thing to observe. The other interesting thing to observe is that here also, so VicReg was around 2018, Barlow twins was 2020-ish, Dino is 2021 plus, right? So as we go from, as we go along the x-axis from left to right, what we are doing is we are going, we are getting more recent. And so what you see is that the more recent models memorize less, okay? So that's one more thing. I won't go into this in too much detail because of lack of time, but similar things you can also do with vision language models like CLIP. So if you recall, CLIP is a model of, it's kind of a text to image representation model. So where you get representations of the text paired with the representations of the images, and it's trained on image caption pairs. And these are slightly different kinds of images because these are images that come from the web, so they no longer have like a standard foreground and background, but these are more, complex, realistic photographic kind of images. And again, so when you do this kind of representation learning, you get images with similar captions are semantically close in the representation space, okay? And we can also do something, similar things over there. And I won't go into the details. You can't do foreground to background, but you have to select a task, and you can do similar kinds of measurements, okay? Okay, so in summary for representation learning, what we showed is we showed a new method for measuring memorization in image representation learning models and vision language models. And it's a practical test that we can actually run on open source models. So if you release an open source model trained on something like ImageNet, we can run our test on it. We can just pull the model and run the test. And what we did find was that the more recent models memorize less, so which is a good sign, I would say. Okay. Any questions on this part of the? Yes, go ahead, Ramya.
Really interesting, and I was wondering, can you comment on how much knowledge of the data set that was used to train those models is needed, and how do you, many times you have models that are released, or maybe the weights are released, or API access is available, but it's not very clear exactly what data they have trained them on. So, so can you comment on how these ideas and this estimated memorization is a function of?
So here what you need to know is the data set that the model was trained on. If you know a subset of the data, you can measure memorization with respect to that subset. Yes, go ahead.
You mentioned that the new models are memorizing less. Is that happening because they're training on larger data sets, or something else about the architecture?
So these are all trained on ImageNet. So I think it's something else about architecture, losses, and so on. Yeah, sorry.
Comment on something, I guess maybe is there a relation with unlearning? Because I was imagining maybe one way to do that is to say you give that image and unlearn it from your model and then make a prediction.
That's actually a very interesting idea. We haven't tried that experiment, but I think it would be quite interesting to try.
Yeah, no, I would worry Because unlearning is a more like complicated procedure. You probably don't really know whether that reliably succeeds or not.
Yeah, that is also true, and especially, for LLMs, for example, how to evaluate proper unlearning is itself a big challenge. Yeah, but it's a good idea. I mean, maybe some gradient update state could, it's a good experiment. Anyways, okay, thank you. Yes, Aditya, go ahead.
Was those size calibrated? Is it like, meaning the dyno, is it a larger model?
It's a larger model. Yeah, it's a larger model, and I think the loss function is also a little bit different, and I think, the parameters are obviously, everything has changed. Yes, exactly. Yes, exactly. Everything has changed. Yes, good. Yes, go ahead.
Like validation experiments you can do with this, where you have a way of training these representation models in a way that explicitly memorizes, and you see that people not memorize.
It's kind of forcing them to memorize, and it's kind of like that Zhang et al. Paper, right? Like, is that what you mean? Where they've random labels paper? Yeah. That's a good question. I haven't thought of that. So many good experiments. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So, thank you. This is a very interesting, point. And okay. So let me then move on to the next part of my talk, which is on memorization in LLMs, right? And so, what motivates this memorization in LLMs? So you guys have probably seen by now that language. So there's been a fair number of, copyright violation has been in the news, to put it mildly, right? So if you have a language model and you ask it, tell me a story, and it starts reciting Harry Potter to you, well, that's not an ideal outcome, okay? So how do we measure memorization in these kinds of things? So very broadly speaking, there has been two kind of clusters of work. So one is kind of algorithmic notions, and I'm putting a bunch of things together over here. So algorithmic notions such as membership inference, algorithmic stability, basically or differential privacy, like auditing differential privacy, that kind of thing, right? So, and this comes from this literature. The problem with this is that LLMs are normally not trained with differential privacy, right? Like if you were training it with differential privacy, well, kind of the privacy parameter will give you an upper bound, a lower bound on memorization, upper bound on privacy, right? And then you could also maybe do something empirical, some empirical test of privacy and so on. But the problem is that LLMs are not really trained with differential privacy. You can't really do that. And what people have also found recently is that membership inference also doesn't really work in LLMs, right? Like if you have pre-trained LLMs, even small ones like Olmo and so on, it's like half and half, right? Was this in the training set or not? The answer is half and half mostly. They're not really right. Okay. Then there has been a second group of work which deals with extractability. So what is extractability? There's like, by now there are probably 1,000 variations of this, but the idea is that given a chunk of text as a prompt, you output the rest. And here again, if I start giving the model the first line of Harry Potter, maybe it goes on and, that would be a base model. Maybe it goes on, does next token completion and gives you the rest of Harry Potter, right? So think about it that way. But, there are different prompting methods, there are different things you can do, and so on, okay? However, that also doesn't really capture memorization, right? In the sense that, verbatim extractability is not necessary for memorization. So it's not necessary. Just because the model memorizes something, it doesn't mean it's just spitting it out right away. And as it happens, sometimes it may also happen due to generalization, right? And so doing this properly is really hard. And in fact, this is there's a recent paper which shows that LLMs can, they can sometimes verbatim complete text with 0 n-gram overlap to training data, right? Where they gave them, so these were not like very, very long texts, but they were able to complete texts. And you can imagine that unless the text is really special, there are maybe a few different ways the text can be completed, and LLMs are sometimes able to do that, right? So we need something a little bit deeper than extractability. So it's not it. Okay, so what we did was we kind of looked a little bit at memorization through an information theoretic lens. So here what we are looking at is, suppose you have like a target sample X, okay, and you have a target LLM. So this is the theta hat is target LLM. Basically your memorization is basically the information in X minus the information left in X after fixing theta hat. So it's basically the mutual information between X and theta hat, right? So this is one way to look at it. And actually this exact formulation is not due to us, it's due to Feldman et al. In a 2021 paper. And from here, we can also think about unintended memorization, right? So unintended memorization is not just about theta hat, like how much information about X is captured in theta hat, but given the, so essentially what we are trying to do is we are trying to capture, let's just say, eccentricities in the sample that are not captured by the distribution, but that are captured by the trained model. So that's kind of the intuition over here, right? So this is our unintended memorization, okay? Sorry, this thing is a little messed up, sorry. Okay, so that is, sorry, go ahead, yeah.
So how can I think of, X and then theta hat, I can see that they're random, but how is theta random?
Theta is the distribution, it's a, yeah, theta is,
What does it mean to condition on theta? It's not random.
So X is a sample drawn from theta. Okay, these are generative models, just to, right? So they itself describe a distribution, right? Like theta hat describes a distribution, right? So this is the distribution induced by theta hat.
When you talk about mutual information and entropy, it's between random variables.
Right, these are
So
random.
theta hat is random because it depends on the data, and
Yes.
the data is random. But theta is but why is the ground? Are you taking some Bayesian approach? Why is the ground truth random? Is it like some Bayesian approach? This is.
Oh, I see. So, okay, when we do the experiments, what we do is for a ground truth, we choose a much bigger language model to run the thing. But here, a ground truth, yes, in this case, it would be like a distribution over okay, let me proceed and get back to you. We can kind of take this offline. We are actually not doing this. This is somebody else's stuff. Yeah. We don't do this. Sorry. This is a way to think about it. I'm sorry. We are not doing this. So I'll have to look up somebody else's paper. But anyway, okay, good. So that was the motivation. But I will answer Nati's question offline. But here you go. But the problem with that approach that I mentioned before was that you can't actually do the measurement. You only have like one sequence. You have one model, theta hat, and maybe you have like a base model which could be a much bigger model, right? In our experiments, we choose it to be a much bigger model. This is also how a lot of the generalization style experiments are done, so it's not like super off. But what we are trying to do is, but we can't actually do that. So what we do is, instead of Shannon information, what we do is we use Kolmogorov information, right? And so that allows us to define memorization for instances, okay? So the memorization of X, given kind of the ideal model theta and then theta hat, which is the current model that you have trained on, is basically the Kolmogorov information of X given theta minus the Kolmogorov information of X given theta and theta hat, okay? Again, notice that you can't also compute the Kolmogorov information. So, but what you can do is you can kind of approximate by compression, Okay, so here basically, so if you're asking the question of how much of Harry Potter is memorized in Llama, what you can do is instead ask the question of how well can you compress Harry Potter with and without Llama. Okay. Again, this is a bit of approximation. I completely agree. It would be nice to have something more principled, but probably you guys can find something. So, so what you do is, what is the compression algorithm that we use? We use arithmetic coding. So we use kind of the probabilities that we obtain from the model to do the arithmetic coding, right, versus from the base. Okay. Okay. So what does this allow us to do? So let us say the measurement can be done. What does this allow us to do? One thing we can do with this is measure model capacity, right? So model capacity or measure or estimate model capacity. And why is this important? Because it is an upper bound on unintended memorization, which is independent of the data size, and it helps us understand scaling laws and training dynamics. And okay, so it looks like I'm very close to being out of time, but I'll try to, but if I could show you one result, this is what I would show is, but the interesting thing that we found was that the model capacity of GPT models is basically just 3.6 bits per parameter. So here we did an experiment where we had these GPT models and we trained them on a very large number of random sequences. And what we basically found is their memorization is kind of peters out at, the capacity kind of peters out at that rate, right? 3.6 bits per parameter. And if you change the precision, it does not change the capacity by very much, okay? We also looked at a bunch of other things, but maybe I can kind of quickly go over them since we are running out of time. You can look at unintended memorization in random data, which we use to measure the capacity versus text. In random data, again, you see this interesting pattern. As the training data size increases, your unintended memorization goes up, and then it kind of flattens out. Where it would flatten out depends on the size of the model, the number of parameters in the model. But with text data, it's, again, interesting. Because this is unintended memorization in bits per parameter, so it goes up and then it goes down, but that's goes up and then it goes down. Okay. You can also see double descent. So if you are looking at the data set to capacity ratio, right, on the x-axis, and we are plotting the test loss in the y-axis, so the double descent starts, you can kind of see double descent in this picture, right? So it starts when the data at this kind of data set to capacity ratio. So you can see that it will go up and then it will start going down again. So you can, and these are, I think, for the random data experiments. You can, okay, I'm just going to skip over some of this. You can also look at, scaling laws of membership inference, which explains why membership inference doesn't really work for the real language models. And you can also look at what is happening. Okay, so in summary, what we did over here is we have a new definition and method for measuring sample level memorization in LLMs, and this leads to some insights on model capacity and generalization and things like that. And I will just end with the pictures of all my co-authors in these papers. Thank you.
Any more questions for Kamalika?
I guess your unintended memorization plots on random data versus actual text data.
Yeah.
Again, should I think of it like a Zhang et al. Type phenomenon where with text data, with that structure, maybe with enough data, it shouldn't memorize. It should really just generalize. But
yeah, definitely. Because for random data, there is nothing you can do but memorize, right? But for text data, yes, that is true. That is the right way to think about it. Yeah. So in the beginning, it's memorizing. After a certain amount of data, it starts generalizing. Text data starts generalizing. Yes.
Okay, if there aren't any other questions, one thing I want to suggest is maybe we can take a group photo outside. before we all go to lunch. But this time, Kamalika again first.